Perhaps a good place to start for socialist feminist consideration of 50 years of women's liberation is 170 years ago. Anne Knight was an anti-slavery campaigner, pioneer feminist and chartist. She probably penned the first ever women's suffrage leaflet in 1847 towards the end of the Chartist movement. She worked in the male-dominated Chartist movement and argued that if the Chartists were serious about universal suffrage, that they had to mean true universal suffrage, that it had to include women on an equal basis to men. She went on to ask the question, can man be free if woman is a slave? Socialism is about creating an entirely different society, one based on human needs, not profit. A society for the liberation of humanity, the true liberation of humanity. There can be no socialism without women's liberation, and there can be no women's liberation without socialism. It's widely acknowledged that the first Women's Liberation Conference in 1970 was inspired by campaigns and activities of working class women in the late 1960s. The most inspirational was the Ford Dagenham women's 3-week strike for regrading and equal pay. Though the women did not win equal pay for another 16 years and another strike, they did act as a catalyst for the 1970 Equal Pay Act. 70 years earlier, in 1918, after 4 years of war work running the transport system, women bus workers took strike action for equal pay and won. In the 1950s, women teachers and women civil servants won equal pay. Yet it took until 2019 for women workers in Glasgow to win a 12-year battle for equal pay, working for a Labour-run local authority. Women's liberation under capitalism is limited, it's minimal, and it certainly is not universal, and it can be taken away when our movement is weak. Another group of working class women in Hull, wives and girlfriends of trawlermen, organised an amazing campaign for better health and safety for fishermen after 3 trawler boat tragedies in early 1968. These women were tagged the headscarf revolutionaries after they set up the Hessle Road Women's Action Committee and drafted a health and safety fishermen's charter. In less than 2 weeks, they'd gathered 10,000 signatures. Lil Balocca led the campaign in the face of sexist comments, harassment and even death threats, but she did not waver. She lost a job and was blacklisted and spent many freezing cold hours on the dock checking the ships for health and safety before they left for sea. She was known to throw herself on the deck of some ships if they failed to comply with the fisherman's charter. Big Lil, as she was known, threatened that if she did not get satisfaction, I'll be up at that Wilson's house, his private house, until I do get satisfaction in some shape or form. That Wilson was Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, and he did concede to meet Big Lil, and then he conceded to the Charter's demands. The Hessle Road Women's Action Committee made national headlines, and for a short period knocked the Vietnam War off the front pages. The 1970 Women's Liberation Conference was the birth of the women's liberation movement in Britain. 400 or so women came together to discuss what women needed for their liberation. The conference closed having adopted 4 demands: for equal pay, equal education and equal opportunities, 24-hour childcare and free contraception and abortion on demand. Later that year, many of the same women caused a major stir when they protested at the Miss World contest. And in the early part of 1971, they organised a national demonstration for women's liberation around the 4 demands. Sally Alexander, one of the organisers of the first conference and the Miss World protest, said 2 decades later that the conference felt like the culmination of something rather than the absolute beginning. The 1960s was a time of rapid social and cultural change. The position of women hadn't been static since the so-called first wave of feminism and the fight for women's suffrage in the early part of the 20th century. Sally Alexander is right. The women's liberation movement of the 1970s was certainly not the beginning. Much was changing for women in the 1960s. Arguably the most revolutionary event for women's liberation in the 20th century, outside of the short-lived gains made for women in the early years of the Russian Revolution, was the pill. The first ever drug designed to treat people who aren't sick. The contraceptive pill was developed in the 1950s and available to married women from 1961. Changing the lives of millions and millions of women. Women's voices could also be heard in popular culture, such as novels, and in particular in pop music. Leslie Gore was just 17 when she sang the song You Don't Own Me, which was to become the anthem for many young feminists in the 1960s. In 1958, Sheila Delaney, a 19-year-old working-class woman from Salford, wrote a groundbreaking play, A Taste of Honey. It was about a young working-class woman who falls in love with a black sailor. She finds out she's pregnant after her lover has sailed and forms a friendship with a young gay man who is willing to take on the role of surrogate father. A play about strong working-class women, making up their own minds and challenging the prejudices and norms of the day. Aretha Franklin takes a song written and sung by Otis Redding, and not only does she make this song her own, but she makes it the song for all downtrodden women who are demanding respect. Loretta Lynn sings a song called The Pill, celebrating its liberatory powers, making the pill popular with women who had previously been unpersuaded to use it, and its claim this song did more to get women to take the pill in certain states in America than anything else did. The women's liberation movement was the culmination of all of this, a movement started by, and for several years dominated by, socialist feminists. Women who had been around the labour movement and the left particularly, women who supported and were part of many working class campaigns and struggles. Women who not only wanted to challenge the position of women in wider society, but also wanted to take on the sexism in their own movement and organisations. Tired of acting as secretary and making the tea, women like Juliet Mitchell and Sheila Rowbotham had plenty to say about developing socialist, feminist politics in the movement. Women's groups sprung up all around the country. Many were campaign groups, action groups, and others were consciousness-raising groups. And the latter begs the question, raising consciousness to do what? In the socialist movement, raising the consciousness of the working class is recognising that we don't just have a common grievance against the bosses, but that we can push to make the bosses make concessions to us. Our entire history is the history of struggle. Every concession that we've won has been hard fought for. Alongside the many women's groups that were set up around the country, a plethora of women's publications began. Spare Rib, probably the most famous of these publications, was launched in 1973 and consistently reported on working class women's struggles. If you compare and contrast the leading publications of the first wave of feminism, Votes for Women, the weekly paper of the WSPU, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst's organisation, to that of Spare Rib in covering working class women's struggles, you see a vast, vast difference. In 1910, women chainmakers took strike action for a minimum wage. This strike lasted for 10 weeks, and you cannot find one mention of this significant struggle in the pages of Votes for Women. In 1976, Trico women workers went on strike for equal pay for 21 weeks, and Spare Rib covered this strike in every issue. The chainmakers won their dispute. The oldest striker was Patience Round, a 79-year-old woman on strike for the first time in her life. She'd been a chainmaker for 67 years. Patience spoke the words that continue to echo down the decades when she talked about the liberatory feeling of downing tools, of taking strike action, and then taking to the speaker's circuit to raise consciousness about the chainmakers' strike. She said, "These are wonderful times. I never thought that I should live to assert the rights of us women. It's been the week of my life, 3 meetings and such beautiful talking." The Trico women strikers 66 years later did as much beautiful talking, not only taking on and beating their male bosses, but having to take on and beat their male colleagues and their male trade union bureaucracy. The Second Women's Liberation Movement Conference in 1971 saw the movement abandon all structures. The following year, vociferous differences around the demand and politics of wages for housework dominated the conference, and year on year the movement became more divided. It was structureless and leaderless, and the divides and schisms between socialist feminists and radical and revolutionary feminists was irreparable. The movement formally came to an end after the conference in 1978, the year before which Britain gets its first woman Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. A criticism often levelled at the women's liberation movement was that it was predominantly white and middle class, and it was, but it's totally unreasonable to dismiss this movement. The women's liberation movement was hugely significant, and it did orientate in part to working class women's struggles, and it very much concerned itself with struggles such as the Grunwick dispute. As Mary Foster, a woman active in the Independent Labour Party in Leeds in 1896, said, "The bourgeois women's movement in all lands has tended to open up the minds of women generally to an examination of the questions which especially affect their sex." You can apply that to the women's liberation movement of the 1970s. Mary Foster went on to say, "It cannot be compared in importance and significance with organisations for working class women to advance their own cause for labour and political freedom." Just as there were working class women's struggles before the women's liberation movement, there were plenty after its demise. Margaret Thatcher, a woman but not a sister, was the best prime minister the bosses ever had in the post-war era. Working class women suffered more under Thatcher than any time since the establishment of the welfare state. Southall Black Sisters was set up in 1979 after the death of Blair Peach on an anti-Nazi demonstration, and it is still going strong today, doing amazing work to defend women against domestic violence. The Sorry Squad, started by young Asian women in defence of Afia Begum, was an inspiration to a new generation of feminists. But the greatest example of working class women forming a movement to defend not just jobs but whole communities was Women Against Pit Closures. Over the past 40 years, feminism and its many strands have developed in fits and starts. Many of the old arguments and theories about man versus capitalism as the main obstacle to women's liberation continue. But campaigns such as Focus E15, Mums and Sisters Uncut are campaigns to defend basic rights that affect working class women's lives, black and white. Housing cuts, cuts in benefits, cuts to jobs, in social care, to domestic violence support services. As socialist feminists, we have to concern ourselves with defending services and making new demands. We have to concern ourselves with organising in our workplaces and in our communities. And we have to concern ourselves with big ideas, ideas that can change the world. Any battles we fight today and tomorrow, we do so standing on the shoulders of working class women's struggles in the past, from the Match Women's strike to the Grunwick women to Women Against Pit Closures. Knowing and understanding our history and learning the lessons will inform us to make our own history. In 1971, on the Women's Liberation demonstration, they mockingly sang the song "Keep Young and Beautiful, it's your duty to be beautiful," while carrying placards saying, "We're not beautiful, we're angry." With collective anger comes fight back, with fight back comes dignity. There's a great beauty in our collective anger at the oppression and sexism that women experience the world over. It's our duty to be beautiful.